Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first joint live event. I have the lovely Natalie Smith here
Hello.
today, and we're super excited because we're going to be talking about maintaining a healthy period and how the period is a fifth vital sign for
Mhm.
not only your general health, but also your fitness goals,
Mhm.
which is why we have Natalie's expertise here, even and especially if you've lost your period. So if this has ever happened to you, this is actually very much for you,
Mhm.
and then to also understand if you're at risk for it. So,
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that I love talking about, especially with populations that I work with, mostly being like women and people in femme bodies, and just like really rewiring that rhetoric. Because I think that this is such an under discussed topic in the fitness industry, and Michelle and I really align with like a very empowerment focused approach. And so that's what we're here to bring all of you. I think the intersection between our two fields is really cool.
yes, absolutely. So, if you're like, who the heck are you people? We're about to introduce ourselves, starting with
Yes.
Natalie.
I'll give a little introduction. So, I am a strength training and fitness coach. I've been in the industry for about 5 years now, and I work both in person and online. Using more like powerlifting, strength training tactics. And then I also co-own a nonprofit called Gym Space Equity. And so my nonprofit focuses on making fitness more accessible to marginalized communities, specifically here in Portland, which is where I'm based. But as far as today's conversation, this story is one that hits personally close to home for me. I lost my period when I first got into fitness, and it was kind of like an uphill battle for a couple of years there. And so, what really inspired me to actually get into coaching and make this my career was the transformation that came out of that, where I was able to break away from disordered eating and a lot more unhealthy measures around fitness, and focus on strength and overall health and well-being, and really wanting to help others do the same. So that is a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today.
My gosh, I'm so happy you're here. This is so, so perfect. And I think every single person, actually, I know every single person I've talked to has like an experience, probably menstrually related, reproductive health related, and it just definitely the people like us who end up doing this work. So, yeah, for me, my background is more scientific in nature. Um, so my background's initially biology and then eventually nutrition. And I've been in biotech industry ever since then. But my passion is really for women's health. So yeah, I guess my analogous story that I had was I had actually endometriosis. So throughout my early reproductive years and never got an answer, just got told to take some Advil and went through a couple iterations of birth control until I really just decided, hey, as someone who's trained in the human body and how it works, shouldn't I know a thing or two about fertility and like what a healthy period is? And if mine is not so great, how do I get it to be quite manageable? And that really launched me down the fertility road, which is how I'm pretty much like just educating first and foremost. And then if anyone does want more guidance, I do offer that as well. But I'm really just here to get information to people. We have so much power to take back. There's so much foundational wisdom that we know from research that isn't making its way to the general population. So that's really what we're aiming to do here today.
Oh yeah.
So our agenda, this is like loose, but what we're generally going to follow is Natalie and I will each give what does losing your period mean? Kind of like the scientific description and then her trauma-informed description. And also not only just what is it losing your period, but what's the cost of it? And then it's not just you've lost your period, it's black and white. There's an existing spectrum that comes into play where actually most women or anyone who menstruates finds themselves over the course of their life, especially if you're really active. Natalie will share a personal experience, which we're really blessed to have, and then also the solutions and approaches we can take, both from a dietary perspective and from a training perspective. And then I'd like to give you some tools on how to use your cycle, on how to basically use it as a health optimization tool, which is my favorite way to teach it.
Awesome.
Okay, awesome. Anything to add to that, Natalie, on the what we're going to
No, I feel
cover?
like that's solid. Yeah. We want to do definitions, personal
Yeah,
experience, and some tangible tools for y'all to take away.
tools. Yes, all about the tools. I love it. So I'll start with biology, the biological side of losing your period. So even if you think this doesn't apply to you because you haven't lost your period, I promise you it does. And it's also really important to know this if you have a loved one or a friend who has lost their period, or if you've lost it in the past and got it back. What it isn't is it's not a problem with your reproductive system. Like a lot of people stress because they think something is physically wrong with the anatomy or the reproductive system itself, and it's actually not at all. All it is your body actually making a deliberate choice because it's functioning quite well to turn off the communication between the hypothalamus, so the part of your brain that talks to your ovaries, because what it's saying is we simply don't have enough energy available to direct the resources, the nutrients, the oxygen to the reproductive system. And that's because I know everyone's pretty familiar with body systems, digestive, cardiovascular, respiratory. Your reproductive system is the lowest on the hierarchy. So in an event of not feeling safe, of intense fight or flight, of a lack of available energy, it's the first thing to go. It's usually the last thing to be regained. I always kind of shock people with the just the fact that ovulation is an optional function. Like your body actually does not need to ovulate every month. You will
Right.
be ovulating every month and menstruating normally when your entire body has enough nutrition and support and energy available to do so. If it does not, because of any stress on the system, it will not do it. So that's how that happens. It's nothing wrong with your body. It's actually your body doing something right to protect you. So when we talk about period loss, like I mentioned, it exists on a spectrum, but when you get to that final sign, the tip of the iceberg that we can see, what it looks like is you haven't had a period for the past 3 to 6 months. You have a loss of ovulation, which you wouldn't really know unless you were tracking that, and I can tell you how to easily do that. And then you also don't have any cervical mucus patterns. Now, cervical mucus patterns, quickly, what they are is in a healthy cycle, one of the parameters of a healthy cycle is a cervical mucus pattern that happens around the fertile window. If you're not seeing any cervical mucus at all, and the definition of it is it could be clear, stretchy, lubricative, this kind of egg white stuff that the fertility world talks about, or it's the more pasty, gummy stuff that you might see in your underwear around the middle of your cycle, but not during the very beginning or toward the end. That's what we say, that's what we're talking about when we say cervical mucus patterns. If you don't have any of that at all, could be an indication that you're either on the HA spectrum or it coincides with losing your period entirely. So the main causes, and both Natalie and I will touch on this, but there are really three buckets when we talk about HA, which is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is the scientific word for the ultimate period loss. But when we say HA in this, we're really talking about the entire spectrum as well. And what puts you on that are the weight loss related energy imbalances. So if you've lost a large amount of weight before and you lost your period with that, it's really common to see that happen. For exercise related, this is typically someone at a high activity level, so chronic, the over exercising, but undernourishing. And then stress related. So this isn't just, feeling stressed out. This is all stresses and assaults on the system. So it's everything we just talked about, but then it's the endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's the emotional stress, it's financial stress. It's like everything you don't think about that puts stress on your body.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you touch on the different distinctions there because I think that a lot of times people just associate HA with like anorexia or being underweight or low BMI, which is first on this list. And women and people of all body types can lose their period, and it can come from so many different factors. It's often multiple of these, specifically that note about stress, like when we're undergoing periods of immense burnout or when we're just like working really hard, whether that's, physically or psychologically, even that can cause that level of imbalance. Because all of those are things where we're outputting our energy. And it's really just down to that relationship between how much energy we're outputting versus how much we're taking in. And I love how you touched on it being like the fifth vital sign, the more optional one, out of all of those reproductive processes, because we really just have to be in a state of like well-being and balance and harmony in order for this to occur, in order for a period to occur.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love how you describe it here too.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on, we're going to get into a lot of the science today, but the process of recovering from HA is way more than just physical. There's so much that goes into it, especially when we talk about fitness, and diet culture and the fitness industry and how many women, view our bodies, a lot of this has an intersection with like disordered eating and societal conditioning or body dysmorphia. And like one of the hardest parts, I know I'll touch on this in my journey, is like grieving that sense of control or grieving like this leaner body that we may have achieved through unhealthy means. And so understanding that like this is a really difficult process to navigate on many levels, and that a lot of times the fitness industry or the environments that we may be operating in kind of encourage these really unhealthy behaviors that are causing us to not have a period. And so it's really difficult to overcome that when you're surrounded by things that are like kind of encouraging you to the contrary. And that's like a little bit of an internal battle that we may face when we're trying to pursue health and well-being. It's like an irony where, the fitness and wellness industry actually encourages a lot of really unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah. I heard this really good term recently called a medical hex,
Hmm.
that a doctor, like the simple thing that if they just tell you, like you basically take this label and it's yours now. Like there's
Yeah,
no other
yeah,
option, there's no solution. It's like,
right.
and then the one I hear a lot for anyone who has lost a period in their youth, or typically, I'm sure you've heard this too, it's like the one thing they'll tell them is, well, it'll be a problem if you want to have kids, with no regard to the effect it has on your entire, like your psyche and the rest of your physical health,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
is
because
very.
you think, what we just talked about was this stress and this energy imbalance, like that impacts every single part of your life. It's reflective not only on a physical level, but on a psychological level of the decreased mental energy that you're experiencing and the chronic overstress and overstimulation that your body is under. Like that's really exhausting state to live in 24/7. And this is all reflected by that not having a period symptom.
Exactly. And that's actually what you're explaining is modern life in a nutshell. Like it's
Mm,
something
so true.
I always tell people, like now that we know this, you have to be on the offensive and the defensive. It's not anymore to just like think about it
Yes.
and say, okay, that's good to avoid.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be proactive, 100%.
Yeah. And then kind of with what we were just talking about, HA is not just about the not having a period. It is a comorbidity. There are so many other things that come with it. You will also see when we talk about disordered eating or, extreme weight loss or whatnot, these are very similar symptoms that occur. They're all related. So, things like feeling cold all the time, chronic fatigue. I want to highlight the decreased performance in the gym and lack of motivation is a little bit of kind of like an ironic one when we're thinking about fitness specifically. But you will feel like an immense difference when you're eating enough versus not. And that will be reflected here, as well as low sex drive, which can impact your relationships, and irritability, extreme hunger also impacts your relationships and just how you show up in the world around you, and in the different, day-to-day activities, because food is the center of everything, is a fuel for everything that we need to be doing.
Exactly. I love this list because it's like even if I haven't physically lost my period, if you have, you can look at this list to kind of see where you fall
Hmm.
on the road there, essentially. And I think the advice that we're eventually going to lay out is going to be helpful for most people, no matter where you're at. But speaking of the health risk of losing your period, it's no simple thing. So if you lose your period and then if it's for a long amount of time, essentially the health risks that accumulate are really massively bone health. So the research has shown that women with hypothalamic amenorrhea, so actually the 3 to 6 months or more of period loss, had 22 to 29% lower spinal bone density, which actually really shocked me when I read this the first time, because that's quite drastic. And then if you think about it over the lifespan, now this is you in your youth. Now in the future, you're at an increased risk for osteoporosis, decreased mobility, the impact on your overall longevity for something that was going on when you were a teenager. So restoring your period can also increase the bone mineral density. So there is hope. We're not going to like tell you anything without a solution. When you do the restorative work, you do see the restoration of the bone, which is wonderful. Also, the thyroid is very impacted. I mean, our thyroid is inextricably linked to our metabolism, so that makes a lot of sense. In
Mhm.
any situation of insufficient energy intake, the thyroid hormones are going to be affected. Sex hormones as well. So when you think about it, it's obvious, right? When we need specifically fat intake to make our sex hormones, and the major ones are estradiol and progesterone. So if you're not consuming enough to divert energy into those hormones, well, you're not going to have a classical menstrual cycle rhythm. So you already are working with low levels of these hormones. When it comes to fertility, the impact that could be there is the endometrium. If you're not regularly menstruating, it can atrophy potentially, which could result in a longer time to conception when you do go to try. So this is why restoring that menstruation is really, really, really important as well. And then this is kind of newer research, but there was a study where they found like inside menstrual blood. If you've been hearing in the news recently, the PFAS, so these polyfluoroalkyl chemicals and these endocrine disrupting chemicals, which you can't avoid in today's world. I mean, they're in everything, our food, our water, our products. Like what's really interesting is losing the menstrual blood during your period can actually serve as a detox pathway for
So,
chemicals like this, right? Because these are really insidious because they're called forever chemicals. Like we
right.
don't excrete them in urine or like sweat the way we do other
Yeah,
toxins. So the fact that your period's kind of doing it for you is pretty sick.
it's really cool.
I know. I was really happy to hear that. Because this one can scare a lot of people, the presence of the PFAS in the modern world. And then from, a way you want to live your life standpoint, it can have an impact on the way you look too. So we mentioned the hair and the skin health on the previous slide, but yeah, this is related to things like thyroid and sex hormones as well. So the lower skin elasticity, low skin moisture, lower collagen production, slower hair growth, and then ultimately immune function. So we know in the body nothing happens in a vacuum, but it feels really important to point out, losing a period is not just affecting your reproductive system. It's affecting everything.
All right. So we'll transition in. I'll share, yeah, a little bit about my experience with period loss. So I'll put here, I've experienced HA multiple times, which is semi-common. Our body kind of develops like a sensitivity to that state of survival and safety, especially after the first time. But I got into the fitness industry relatively young, like in my teen years. And for me, it was all about aesthetics from the beginning. I grew up overweight. I was never really involved in sports, and I never felt comfortable in my body. That was a really big identity component. Like, I felt very uncomfortable in my body from a very young age, which I know is a story that many women can share. And as I was diving into it, kind of around the era of like macro tracking and lifting becoming super common and mainstream for women, I applied a lot of my very like perfectionistic, controlling mentalities to fitness, and that led to really obsessive patterns. Like tracking my calories and trying to eat 12 to 1400 calories a day while I was training 5 to 6 times a week, sometimes multiple times per day. Very, very low fat diet, like maybe less than 30 or 40 grams per day, which is far below the amount that we need to maintain hormonal health. And I was doing all of this and I lost, I think, over 30 pounds in the span of like a few months. And on one level, I felt so much validation, right? Like the typical response of everyone around me complimenting my weight loss and asking me, what I was doing. And it really became a huge part of my identity. I loved the lifting and fitness component, but I was at this constant war with food where like all of my thoughts were preoccupied by how much I was eating and what I could and couldn't eat and how I was going to get to my next meal and macros and calories and all of these things, right? And I didn't fully realize it at the time, but I was exhibiting a lot of these symptoms. Like my energy completely took a hit. I had basically no social life because my life revolved around food. I was always cold, even in 80, 90-degree weather. And I had completely stopped having any sort of cervical mucus, and those symptoms just went away, and so many different areas where it impacted my life. And so I, didn't necessarily see this as an issue at the time until like about a year and a half into my fitness industry or my fitness journey. I went to the doctor for an appointment, just like a routine checkup. And for me, it was that my blood pressure was really, really low. And they had seen that in combination of the extreme weight loss. And so that they were like, we're going to put in a referral for you. This is possibly concerning. And I went to a dietitian and was like, yeah, lost your period. And also you're at all these other health risks. And we're going to have to restore some weight on you. And initially that felt really scary because it was essentially me abandoning everything that I had known and internalized, and been teaching myself. But I was also more afraid of the health ramifications that could come if I didn't, change my approach. And I was able to personally continue exercising through that period. I just had to really reevaluate my relationship with fitness and my body and figure out how to integrate it in a way that was actually supportive and sustainable long term. Um, so yeah, I think that's a good brief synopsis to start. But and then I'll talk a little bit about how I regained it. So initially, I was tracking my food, which is something that I had been doing for a long time, just, in order to eat enough. For me, that looked like eating between like 2,500 and 3,000 calories a day, which was like basically double what I was eating before. And that felt like a huge shift. On one hand, there's a part of me that was really excited because I had completely restricted myself from food for months and years. But on the other hand, it felt like an immense loss of control. And I was really afraid of where it would go and of like not gaining too much weight. And that, I restored initially like 5 or 10 pounds from that and was able to kind of return to a healthier baseline. But then when I got more into athletics and powerlifting and my energy output increased, I kind of fell into the same cycles like years later. And that led me to really have to just like give up control, especially around food, in order to support high activity levels. So when I got more into strength training and powerlifting, I still kind of held on to like, I don't want to gain too much weight, or like I need to control my food. And I relapsed a little bit. And I was able to shift, and I think fully heal my relationship with my body once I started focusing on just how strong it could be and how well I could perform and how good I could feel instead of trying to look a certain way. So for me, it was really like an ongoing battle and relationship. And I can definitely say that the thing that healed my relationship with myself and my body was shifting to a performance-based approach with fitness of just like, I want to fuel myself to feel strong and to learn what I'm capable of and learn what my body can do, versus an aesthetics-based one. And it wasn't until I really made that the forefront of the relationship that I was able to fuel my body in the way that it needed to, because now there was like a direct purpose, right? If I didn't eat enough, it would change, it would impact my performance. I wouldn't feel good in my training sessions, and I would feel those ramifications on my body. Whereas if it were still with that aesthetics-based lens, I could get away with like not feeling so great because it was for this body that I was pursuing. So once I gave up that sense of trying to pursue a leaner self and I focused completely on something else, I was able to healthily restore my cycle, begin eating intuitively, and have a much better relationship with fitness.
Oh my gosh. I I really, it's really powerful how everything is a mindset. Like we from the
Yes.
nutrition world, it's very much like, yeah, it's a matter of calories in, calories out. And actually everything you're saying is completely spot on. It's more of a mental game
It
often than
is.
it is a physical one. I also love how you called out the caloric need, your caloric need changing.
Mhm.
So even in the research, when we see the period restoration, it
Yep.
looks like even for active individuals, it's around 2,200 to 2,600 calories. And we don't think that that's us. Even the
Yep.
traditional, I know most people look at like, based on a 200,000 calorie diet for nutrition packs, and they're like, that's for men, that's not for me. And you
Right,
say a
right.
number like that, and it's like, no, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that has been a really like ongoing conversation I have with women that I work with, of just like eating over 2,000 calories and that being like normalized. And we're so used to having to stay below that number. And that's where, so many of these experiences come from. But it's like when you are asking a lot of your body, when you are pursuing these fitness goals, or when you just have a lot of stressors in your life, again, that's so much energy output and it needs to be matched with the amount that you're taking in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how do you get it back? Well, you beautifully explained it the way you did it. And when we look at the conventional, I think it's helpful. Natalie and I have both broken down the conventional and then, looking in the research, looking at what actually works when you take the whole mind and body into consideration. From a purely nutritional perspective, based on our dietary guidelines and a lot of modern dietitians, unfortunately, the conventional method for treating HA is pretty much eat more calories and increase
Mhm.
your carbohydrates.
Mhm.
But looking at what research tells us is optimal for reproductive health versus things like dietary guidelines, we know that basically in a modern eating plan, things like fat are incredibly restricted, protein is way underestimated, and carbs are often very overestimated. And our food system is full of easy carbohydrates. So if you're purely focusing on eat more carbohydrates, eat more and eat more carbohydrates, you're
Mhm.
typically reaching for what like ultra processed foods or kind of refined carbs. And what it doesn't necessarily address is what you need, which is nutrient repletion.
Mhm.
So we're going to be talking about using nutrient dense foods. And what that's going to do automatically is control for blood sugar balance, which is the risk you run when you just increase carbohydrates. So we like to say start with the basics first. And that simply is really, like you heard Natalie say, eating more is really the first and foremost. But then looking at your plate, where can we incorporate more nutrient dense foods with an emphasis on natural carbs, so like nature's carbs, so like the vegetables and the whole grains and fat sources, and maybe more fun foods. This is kind of breaking those old habits and beliefs of like bad foods, terrible
Mhm.
foods, trigger food, like slowly reintroducing and rewriting that. From the research too, knowing that just a 25% caloric reduction for only 2 to 3 months can disrupt your menstrual cycle to the point where you stop ovulating. This is just underscoring how important your energy needs have to be met consistently in order to maintain that reproductive function. So, I mean, even though 25% caloric restriction, what could that look like? Say you try intermittent fasting for a couple months. And instead of intermittent fasting, where you're just shortening your feeding window, which is what it truly should be, but
Yeah.
what a lot of where you're getting 3 meals a day in, what a lot of women do, or anyone really can do this, we see it often, is they just start deleting meals.
Yep.
Breakfast goes, dinner goes, and then there's your energy imbalance right
Yep.
there.
Yep.
So working with someone like Natalie can help you determine your total energy expenditure especially when you're on a fitness plan, because you're going to want to know how much you need to eat to hit your total energy expenditure per day.
Totally.
Yeah, and then if you wanted to give your note about tracking and how to maybe handle that, if that's not something you're super comfortable with,
Yeah,
that's
I
helpful.
love your conversation here around it's so interesting, like the dietary guidelines versus like the fitness guidelines versus like what we need for this very unique instance. We can't really follow either of those because like from my industry, protein is so overemphasized, whereas in mainstream nutrition advice, it is underemphasized. And what we really need a lot of in HA recovery is just like breaking food rules and breaking like what we've internalized around nutrition and kind of having to reinvent it. And so I love how you talked about focusing on those nutrient dense sources. And I think it also requires a lot of rewiring our relationship with food to incorporate more fun foods, more calorically dense foods, because that's what your body needs at this time, and doing so without it, ruining your brain or making you feel like you did something wrong. And then in terms of tracking, I will say that for me personally, and some women that I work with, there's a lot of power in breaking away from tracking, especially if that is how you lost your period. But there's value, I think, in doing it maybe in those earlier stages just to understand, how much you need on a basic level. Other tactics that I like to use are just like food journaling, like just writing down what you eat on a daily basis, make it neutral, and not necessarily tied to numbers. And then I'll also have clients do that in combination with like self-reflection questions after, like, how did this food make me feel? What thoughts came up for me? What experiences came up in my body? How did I notice it impact my energy levels? Another thing is just use like visual cues. So that could look like taking pictures of your food as you're adding more in and really being able to see like I have more carbohydrates, more fat on my plate. This is what I'm eating habitually. And I think that can help with maybe the more emotional side of it, and not being as tied to numbers if that's something that someone needs.
Totally. Those are amazing tips because
Yeah.
it takes a lot of self-honesty. I mean,
Mm.
we were all raised, this is why I started this slide with this bullet point. We were all raised by people who were raised in the anti-fat craze.
Yes.
So, and also that we all know the diet culture of the late 90s and the early
Yep.
2000s was not
Coming
it.
back. Yep.
And it's coming back. Like, yeah, so exactly what Natalie said, when you ask yourself these questions, because it really is a lot of introspective questions, where are you, because I can give recommendations, but really at the individual level, what macronutrient, when we talk carbs, fats, protein, are you cutting out the most? Fully agree. Everyone's like super into protein. You can get protein a lot easier these days with all these fancy like consumer
Yeah.
foods. But in the research, we see that by far and away, with when women experience period loss, the macronutrient they're cutting the most is fat.
Hmm.
Makes sense. We were all brought up to completely fear fat.
Yeah.
Though we know now in nutrition research that was completely unfounded. And unfortunately, it is taking time to inject that back into mainstream beliefs.
Yep.
But we also see foods like animal fats, protein, so dairy, like oils, the avocado oil, the olive oil, those are needed to support absorption of vitamins. We have many vitamin soluble, fat soluble vitamins, bone health, because they're going to let your basically when you absorb it, then you can actually build the bone back. And then, like I alluded to earlier, it builds our sex hormones, and your body will either make stress hormones or sex hormones.
Hmm.
So if you're in this chronic state of your body is getting the signal it's not safe, you can't divert energy to the reproductive system because there isn't enough to go around, that's a stress signal. When we finally are eating enough, and namely that precursor, that healthy dietary fat, that's what's going to increase the levels of the estrogen and progesterone that allow your cycle to kick back on. So that switch, it can be turned back on, and this is essentially how we do it by signaling the body. And then
Hmm.
carbohydrates, again, it's the ones that come from nature. So if it's coming from the ground, don't worry about it. If it's a carb source,
Hmm.
they're definitely important, but they're not the only macronutrient to focus on. I love how Natalie mentioned the protein fixation.
Hmm.
Definitely important.
Yeah.
And when you build your meal, it's a really good idea to go
Totally.
protein first, right? And then kind of
Yeah.
the supportive.
Especially as we're restoring weight, and
Yeah,
focusing on bone health, like it's really important that we have muscle mass, and protein is essential for ensuring that too.
fully.
Yeah.
Yep. So I do the same thing. I say, okay, start a meal with protein, and then fat should be the next biggest on your plate in the source where it's what we consider to be a healthier version of a fat. And
Mhm.
then carbs are the supportive actors of the meal, where the protein is more the star. And in nature, protein comes packaged in fat. So typically you don't have to go searching for these macronutrients if you're getting them from sources where they're naturally found together, like animal products is really the best way to do it. So the eggs, the fish, dairy, stews, anything with the bone in, skin on, meat like that, that's really good sources. However, this is why it's easier to do it if you do consume meat and fish. If you're
Mhm.
vegetarian, it is a bit harder. But
Yeah.
I know many, and actually HA is a lot more common in vegetarians for this exact reason.
Yeah, and specifically around that protein fat combination. Because I'm vegetarian and I have been for like 10, 15 years. But during this process, I had gone to like just eating pure protein, like lots of egg whites, lots of protein powder, etc. During my HA journey. And then in recovery, like really having to think more about how I can intentionally add in fat and such into my diet, from vegetarian sources. But yeah, you're so right. And a lot of women who are vegetarian and are not necessarily in the fitness industry, like they're not thinking about protein and how to incorporate that in their diet.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because there are ways, even though it is a bit harder, there are ways to absolutely do it. So we talked about, like you said, great, put the yolk in the egg, get some more
Yep.
dairy, cheese, soy. So sometimes
Yes.
you hear conflicting research and evidence about soy. What I'll just quickly say on that is the way we eat soy is the problem. So like the Beyond Meat burgers or like the soy milks, like when it's more processed, when you have a
Mhm.
high frequency of foods like that, in moderation, they're fine.
Mhm.
But if you're looking at miso or tempeh or natto, like the more fermented and true to form soy, those you can eat without problem, and they're quite high in protein and also a bunch of other really healthy micronutrients. So just to throw that out there, soy's not
Yeah,
bad. It's the type that you want to watch what type of soy.
totally. Um, Yeah, I feel like we talked a good amount about this, but
Yep.
I just to reiterate that the importance is that calorie intake because that's going to solve the energy imbalance. And then also noting that hunger signals can be a really interesting thing for HA because sometimes we feel a down regulation in them initially, which is part of that bodily survival process, right? Like when we know we're not going to be getting enough food, we kind of just lower our energy and our other hormones that we're producing, including our hunger hormones. But usually, once we start kind of invigorating them a little bit and getting that metabolism regulating again, getting more food in our body, our hunger goes up a lot. And you'll notice maybe extreme hunger. I know that's something that I felt where I just couldn't get full from food for like weeks and months that I experienced that. And that is basically your body trying to catch up for all of the times that you've been restricting it and then it hasn't been getting enough fuel. And it's really trying to regain this sense of safety where it knows that food is coming in on a regular basis. And that's how we're going to be able to restore our cycle. So just to note that, that when we're experiencing that down regulation in hunger hormones, when we don't really feel hungry, you might require more structure. It might feel more forced. But that once you start to feel that extreme hunger, this is like really your time to listen to that because your body is asking for that food for a reason. Um, and then I also noted to seek support from a nutrition practitioner, especially if there's like any sort of disordered eating with it. I highly recommend choosing like a weight neutral or intuitive eating one, also like a sports performance nutritionist, dietitian, someone who understands this lens and who isn't going to come at it with like a typical mainstream dietary approach.
Love that.
Yeah.
Very important to know. And then finally on the nutrition stuff, it's important what you eat, then also when you eat and how you eat equally important. So if you fall on the spectrum that we're talking about, your body will respond best to consistent fuel because it's signaling safety, it's signaling enough, it's signaling, hey, you can turn off this fight or flight survival mechanism. When you're getting your period back or you want to restore the parameters of a healthy menstrual cycle, even if you haven't lost it yet, breakfast is really a non-negotiable in this phase, and that's not coffee. Not even coffee
Yep.
with protein. I'm so sorry,
Right.
which
Not breakfast.
I
Yeah.
am an offender of,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure. But it's when within 30 to 60 minutes of waking up, if you are someone who just can't stomach the thought of food or you're not used to eating that early, honestly, start with like a handful of nuts or like
Mhm.
a little tub of yogurt, and you can split it into two meals, and then eat the other one like a half an hour later, a few hours later. But what we're really trying to focus on is sending that signal to your body right when you wake up that we're not in this fasted state anymore. That also includes for workouts. If you work out in the morning, we're not going to want to do them fasted in this recovery phase, for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely all about just creating that environment of safety. And so that's why we put here like at least 3 meals and 1 to 2 snacks, but even more than that, maybe what it takes, just that constant source of energy coming in. And like I view that as affirmation for your body every time you're eating. Like I'm taking care of you, like you're getting what you need, you're getting your needs met. And then yeah, that nutrition should always be prioritized pre and post workout. That's kind of how, if we are able to keep training during period recovery, you're going to ensure that by eating before and after you work out.
Amazing. Exactly. And I like how you talked about the hunger cues as well. So really checking in, internal check-in before, post. I think we even mentioned like, what are my stress responses like right now? Like, how is my appetite changing in response to that? So just it's a good time to get really in tune with the hunger cues for sure. And then just to know if this is you or you're interested in optimizing for this area, one of the so four of the nutrients actually that we would recommend focusing on would be namely calcium. And you can find this in the full fat dairy. So full fat is actually superior when it comes to restoring reproductive health than the skim or the low fat counterparts of dairy. We know this from the research. Fish, so this is like the fatty fish, so salmon and sardines, leafy greens, bok choy, sesame seeds, almonds, and broccoli are really rich in calcium. Vitamin D, incredibly important for hormonal health and really just overall health. It is kind of hard to get adequate amounts of this from food if you're not in the sun for like more than half an hour with no sunscreen on per day. But a supplement for vitamin D is a really good idea. It's most people are deficient in this anyway, and it's quite safe to supplement with. So I recommend starting with around 4,000 IU a day. Vitamin K2, typically D and K2 come together because they enhance the absorption of the other. So that's actually really helpful for bone health as well, if you are in this sort of HA spectrum. And then finally, everyone could benefit from not only vitamin D, but magnesium. Every cell in our body needs magnesium. And again, it's probably one that we're not consuming enough from, even if you do have a healthy diet. So supplementation, if you're interested, could be really safe at around 200 to 400 milligrams per day.
So,
Training.
okay, our last portion of the
Love it.
conversation. Yeah, let's see. So kind of what we touched on a little bit earlier was that, oh, thank you so much in the chat. I'm
Thanks,
so
Shannon.
Yay. Kind of what we touched on a little bit earlier is that sometimes we do need to stop exercising during HA recovery. And this is just due to that energy imbalance, that sense of safety. Everyone's body is a little bit different here. And I think a lot of this depends on why HA occurred. So if it was due to overactivity, or, losing a ton of weight, this may be more common. And so during those periods, you may only really be able to like safely go for a walk and do yoga, very low intensity movements as your body is restoring the sense of trust. And then just noting that high intensity training is a stressor, and we're really just trying to be mindful of how much stress we're taking in during this time. And that's kind of why this may be necessary. The goal is not to have to avoid stressors forever, nor is that possible, but we're just being really mindful of those factors we can control during this period. And also to note, yeah, at the bottom, that some can keep training as long as our nutritional needs are being met. That was the case for myself, but maybe not for everyone. And then, yeah, I can touch on this too. So, with the longer term approach, one thing that we see a lot on social media that like really irks me is this idea that women, people with uteruses, just like can't do intense training. Like hit cardio and heavy lifting is just bad for you because it's too dangerous. You're fucking with your hormones. And that is very much not the case, And it's also like very disempowering approach, and just like to completely exclude this population from something that could be really supportive for them. I know, especially in my journey, it was really crucial to my healing with my relationship with my body, where I wouldn't have gotten that with a different style of training. So it's really just about being mindful of how we can do that sustainably. We are capable of a lot. Our bodies are resilient, our bodies are adaptable. We can put ourselves under immense amount of stress, in under controlled parameters and with enough fuel and recovery in between. So it's really just being mindful of that balance, making sure that we're taking rest days, that we're using controlled progression, that not every single week is super intense and heavy, that we're taking those recovery weeks and building up gradually, that we're listening to our body signals. That's something that I really focus on with my clients, is having a sense of intuition with training, with intensity. And that as a baseline, we are fueling and recovering for those training sessions. We know that if we're pushing ourselves, we need more food. We need more energy in the tank in order to do that. And generally, when you're in a symbiotic relationship with those things, where you're giving yourself a lot of fuel, you have the capacity to push yourself. It's just a relationship that goes hand in hand that way.
Go off. I love it. I love it. I love it. I
And
love
then if
it. Yeah,
touch
take
on
this
this
one.
one a little bit? Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I was gonna say you
Oh,
go
me?
for it and then
Okay.
I'll jump in.
So kind of on that same note, a lot of what we see on social media is maybe you can lift heavy, maybe you can do more intense training sessions, right? But only during your luteal phase or not during your follicular phase or whatever the guidelines may be. And this is something that I've dove into in the research a little bit, and it's just like the evidence is really inconclusive on that. You know, everyone experiences their cycle differently. Like Michelle talked about having endometriosis, that's a factor. I work with people who have PCOS, also a factor, you know, like our cycle looks so different. And a lot more of it just comes down to how we are fueling ourselves during those times, right? We have a lot more substantiated evidence around calorie needs being higher around our cycle, around different nutrients that we need to focus on. And generally speaking, if you are creating that environment of safety with nutrition, with fueling, you will be able to push yourself and to challenge yourself and keep training hard and heavy when you want to, especially if that's paired with this sense of intuition. So I think that's kind of the bottom line here, making sure that we're giving ourselves enough food and that we're being in tune with how our body is feeling throughout that process. And that's kind of how you can morph this into your own life, and around your own cycle.
Absolutely. I love what you've said because I see everything cycle syncing. Like,
Yep.
yeah, and I find it can be restrictive to the point of detrimental, where you
Yep.
can only, like you're saying, eat root vegetables on these 2 weeks and you can only hang out with your friends on these. And it's like
Right, right.
it's I love cycle syncing as an energy management tool because we know our hormones have different personalities and like
Yeah.
I'm right before my period and like I'm tired. Like, but it's if I felt like doing a hard workout, I would.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
but
totally.
since that's what you're saying and that's the key. It's about listening to what your body's saying. And I
Yeah.
think the having the know-how of what your biology is doing makes me feel a lot better. Like, oh, I'm not tired because I'm being lazy and I'm being a piece of
Yeah.
shit. Like I'm tired because my progesterone is surging and it's telling me to like it doesn't like to be in the presence of cortisol, which is what a hard
Right.
workout would do. So it's good guidance, but
It
don't
is.
live and die by that screenshotable
Yeah.
day 1 through 15 nonsense that is going
Exactly. And also just knowing that your body adapts over time, you know, as we start doing high intensity exercise more often, our capacity for it increases and our ability to regulate does too. And so it's kind of like if you never, you know, toe outside of these very strict guidelines, you don't get to know yourself and your body in that way, which can be really valuable. And then yeah, let's see. Do you want to, I think you did this one. Do you want to talk about how long it takes to get your cycle back?
Yeah, super quickly because I do want to spend some time on the like real nitty-gritty cycle stuff too because
Okay.
I find that
Okay.
so exciting. But in the research when they were trying to restore cycles for women who had lost them, it could take anywhere from 2 to 15 months, which is like a big range. But what the biggest factor is how long were you without your period and how far along were you on the HA spectrum? So it's just a good benchmark to know. It's not going to happen overnight. If it took you years and years of not having this sense of safety and these nutrients not getting into your body, it's going to take you a long time to get it back. Another thing you can do is get a full nutrient panel from your doctor, and that will help guide your supplementation strategy because this goes in hand with nutrient like depletion, which we want to replete. And then also looking at stress and how it influences the sex hormones. So if they're constantly competing with each other, one of the fastest, easiest ways to reduce that stress signaling is to just get really good sleep most nights. So 7 to 9 hours most nights is the recommended duration for women. And that is also like a foundational factor of a healthy cycle. So, cycle tracking, not to be confused with cycle syncing. First, I'll just explain when we talk about this spectrum, what are the things that you want to be looking for in your cycle? Well, I talked about it being kind of like an iceberg. So, this is obvious to everyone where you've lost your period. Okay, we know we have a problem because I haven't menstruated in a couple months. But what we don't see and we don't address is all of us that are below the surface. And what that looks like when before you're about to ultimately lose your period, your cycle can start to get long, or you can skip some. Like maybe you skip a period 1 month, but then it's back the next. You're on the spectrum heading toward that like tip of the iceberg. So you're still menstruating normally, maybe you skip some here and there, but maybe you are still displaying disordered eating and or over exercise patterns. Here, what we see is you have a regular cycle, but you're not ovulating. So this is interesting. You can have a period but not be ovulating, which doesn't make it like a true period by definition. But if you're just seeing a bleed, everything would be totally normal in your world. So one of the values of using your cycle as a health diagnostic tool, it would be to read your fertile signs to understand, are you ovulating or are you not each month, which is just a marker of health. And then down here, which is probably where most of us have been at some point in our life, if we're not already, you have regular cycles, but you have the mindset, beliefs, habits, and maybe some of those deep-rooted things behind HA, where it's like we're in a constant state of high stress. We have a high demanding job. We have a high demanding life. We're probably not eating enough calories on a normal basis. We're probably training too heavy for the amount that we're eating. And just kind of these diet culture and other kind of deeply instilled beliefs about food and women and thinness in culture.
Mhm.
And it's an untouched population that we don't think we need to worry about any of this stuff until you lose your period, but there's actually a lot you can do preventatively to never get here. So this is just something that I teach, and this is like my favorite thing in the world, to use your own cycle as your monthly report card for your health. And I stuck, so this is actually my real data. This is not an HA cycle, but it's very easy to see how it might be if certain factors were to arise. So the things that I look for are, what are your baseline temperatures? So this is like pre-ovulatory, we have lower temperatures than in our ovulatory phase. And if the pre-ovulatory temperatures are below 97.4 degrees Fahrenheit, that tells us metabolism issue. So maybe it's thyroid, maybe it's just you're not getting enough calories to sustain your basal metabolism rate. This is super common to see when you're on your way to period loss. What you could also see are short or light periods. So a typical healthy bleed should be somewhere from 3 to 5 days, starting off heavy, then tapering to medium, then to light over the course of those 3 to 5 days. If it's really scant, that could be a sign of the HI spectrum as well. Like we mentioned earlier, little to no cervical mucus patterns around that midpoint of your cycle or where you would potentially be ovulating. Spotting before your next period is also a potential red flag or something you would want to investigate, because what that means is the progesterone that you're making in the second phase of your cycle, post-ovulatory, it's not enough to keep the uterine lining from shedding until your period. So it's actually, this is like a free progesterone test. If you see spotting before your period starts, it's okay, the progesterone you're making, it needs a bit of support. What I also love about this is once we confirm ovulation, these numbers you see right here, this is what's considered your luteal phase. So luteal phase just means how many days was it since ovulation to the start of your next cycle. Optimally, this is between 12 and 14 days, always. If it's any less than 12 days, another indication of low progesterone and potentially a sign that you are on the HA spectrum, because we see shorter luteal phases when someone is in this dysregulated state. So super cool ways that you can just learn to read. This is body temperature. And I actually, to be perfectly frank, the reason these are low temperatures is because it's coming from my Oura ring, which is not my core body temperature, which is always a few degrees lower because it's on my hand. So I would recommend doing, and I have done, oral thermometer in conjunction with the wearable for at least a couple months to make sure, for that very reason. Are your baselines truly low, or is it just because you're wearing a device that is not actually reading your core body temperature? And then learning how to read your cervical mucus patterns. So no internal checking. It's really just a wiping system that has a standardized way of basically translating what you see every day. And amazingly, it gives us so much insight into your health beyond just reproduction. So you see, I mentioned thyroid here, metabolism. We can go into cervical cancer risk from here. We can go into infection. We can go into just heart health, like the things that this tells you,
So
that
fascinating.
it's fascinating. And most of us just like flush it down the toilet, like to be perfectly
Right.
honest.
Totally.
And we're not taught this, but it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, I learned so much in those last couple slides. I love it, especially the iceberg metaphor, obviously, so such a powerful visual, but just understanding how so many of us can relate to these experiences in some way, even if it's not that like more extreme version of HA itself. And then how, if we're tracking our cycle, we can see those signs before you actually get to the point of losing your period physically. Yeah.
Totally. And a lot of the time, it sounds obvious, like, oh, you stop
Yeah.
ovulating, like that's serious. But how many of us actually know we're
Right.
ovulating every month? Not very, probably not very many of us.
Right.
And it's not just for if you want to have kids, like which is typically how people do it. But no, this is for general health, like on a month-to-month basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, Natalie, I think we
Yeah,
did
that's
it.
good for now. Yeah. I think we presented on everything.
I love it. Well, thank you so much to the people, to you first and foremost, but like thank
Yes.
you to the people
Thank
who
you for
like,
having me.
of course, and thank you to everyone who joined us live. It was so cool to like have this cute group.